Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig VanSandt. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. Sexual harassment has been in the headlines for several months now, with the Me Too, Believe All Women, It's On Us, and Time's Up movements gaining momentum to try and end workplace harassment. However, a related but strikingly different problem involving the exploitation and trafficking of men and women, boys and girls, remains relatively unknown. On this morning's show, we will explore the roots and prevalence of human trafficking in Iowa, the United States, and literally across the globe. To help us understand the extent of this problem and the harm that it does, we have two expert panelists with us. First, we're privileged to have Teresa Davidson, a nurse practitioner and board member of the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking. Teresa is also the head of a local nonprofit organization, Chains Interrupted, which has been instrumental in fighting trafficking in Iowa. Teresa, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Second, I'd also like to welcome Mitch Mortvedt, the Assistant Director of the Iowa Department of Public Safety, Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Mitch, thank you for coming all the way from Des Moines to be with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
As I mentioned previously, human traffic is generally not as widely recognized as sexual harassment in the workplace. Sexual harassment is certainly not a new phenomenon, nor is it uncommon. And it's precisely the ubiquity of that problem that seems to make it such an intractable one. On top of that, it seems that almost everyone recognizes that sexual harassment is wrong, and yet it goes on all the time. As we will find out, a large segment of human trafficking relates to the sex trade. That's why I make the relationship with sexual harassment. And yet, as I understand the issue of human trafficking, it is not nearly as widely recognized as sexual harassment. So with that, I'd like to turn to Teresa to ask, what does human trafficking involve? How widespread is it?
Sure.
If you can give us a summary.
A summary, sure. It's a bit of a complex question because the Polaris Project, which is a fairly big expert in the field, has identified 25 different types of human trafficking.
Really?
Yeah, and so it gets pretty complex. But at its core, human trafficking is modern day slavery, meaning that someone is providing a service, either in labor or sex, usually, trafficking, against their will. Maybe this agreement isn't what they would have agreed upon, for very little pay, no pay, very much against their will.
Okay, so when you say modern day slavery, are you referring to what Americans typically think of slavery? Having to work without being paid?
Yes, without being paid or to do things they don't want to do, especially in the sex trafficking, the sex slave trade. People are being forced to provide sexual acts. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's for money. It can be for anything of value, food, clothing, shelter, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve full-blown prostitution either. It can also involve pornography, being filmed against your will, having to create these films that you don't want to do, stripping, different things like that. And then also, importantly, within the federal law, the definition, it involves force, fraud, or coercion, meaning someone's actually physically forced, or they're tricked or manipulated, or they're persuaded in some way by threats or blackmail, something like that is involved.
Okay. Well, since you brought up law, let me turn to our legal expert. Mitch, how big an issue is this for the Division of Criminal Investigation in Iowa?
Law enforcement in general is still trying to get their minds around this, or their a focus of how to quantify this within our communities and within our state. As Teresa alluded to, it has become more and more popular, more the communities, the public in general has become more aware of it, as organizations such as Teresa's, as law enforcement, has tried to make this more public. Specifically within the Division of Criminal Investigation, or more importantly, the Department of Public Safety, she also mentioned the Polaris Project. And the Department of Public Safety is the point of contact for the state of Iowa as far as the Polaris Project. They get tips called into them with human trafficking, and it's tips from the community, from members of our communities. And whether they see something, they hear something, they call these tips in, and if it meets the Polaris Project's criteria, their threshold, those will be pushed out to law enforcement, and we are the point of contact for that. So everything within our Division of Intelligence within the Department of Public Safety is the point of contact for that. And what they do is then push it out to the local jurisdiction that has the authority and the jurisdiction within their communities to investigate those. As far as being able to put numbers to human trafficking, it's tough to at this point. It's just new. The crime itself is not new enough, but it has become more apparent to law enforcement and to non-governmental agencies that are helping support and trying the victims and trying to get them out of that lifestyle. Everybody's trying to work together, and it's really been a focus in the last probably 2, 3, 4 years within Iowa of really trying to quantify this problem. There's a lot of times, because of the coercion and the threats that she alluded to, that victims don't necessarily want to work with law enforcement because they're afraid, whether it's threats against themselves, whether it's threats against their family. So where Teresa may come in contact with these victims, law enforcement doesn't always. So some of her numbers will be different than what law enforcement is seeing, if that makes sense.
Sure. I've been aware of this problem for a number of years. But I can't say that I've ever seen someone, or maybe I just don't pay attention enough, but where do we typically find the victims of human trafficking?
You want me to take that, or
Sure,
go ahead?
we both can. Go ahead.
Well, like I said, there are 25 different types of human trafficking. So one particular type is online solicitation. Okay, so you know that there was recently a law passed that victims and survivors of human trafficking can now have a recourse against websites that profited from their exploitation, which is great. I'm a little concerned that now those websites are going to go international or underground, and this isn't going to stop it. It's just going to make it more difficult for law enforcement, who has been able to kind of track some of these people on these websites that are well known, that they're now going to be a little bit lost to us. But it is a step in the right direction, that it raises a lot of awareness. And the very website that exploited a personal friend of mine, Craigslist, has now taken down completely their personal section and are no longer exploiting people for their own profit, which is great.
Sure.
But back to that, online solicitation. So one website is Backpage.com. And Creighton University actually did a study and said, okay, how many people are soliciting for sex online on this one website? And what they found was that there were 1,350 every month in Iowa, unique people soliciting for sex online, or advertising.
Meaning offering sex or looking to buy sex?
Yes, and offering themselves for sex. And in Cedar Rapids, there were 300 unique individuals advertising themselves for sale for sex online on Backpage.com every month. So then Creighton University said, well, how many of those would be trafficking victims? Meaning force, fraud, or coercion, or what I failed to mention before was anyone under 18. that's involved in the commercial sex trade is automatically a human trafficking victim by law.
Okay.
So how many of these are minors? How many of these look like they've been under someone else's control? And very conservative estimate was 18%, meaning 18% was almost 100% sure of these ads, which is 54 people a month in Cedar Rapids from one type of trafficking on one website.
Wow. Scary. Mm-hmm. And you said you were going to chime in, Mitch.
Yeah, it's difficult for law enforcement. The Players Project and the national statistics may show that last year they referred, say, 170 or 180, or that they received 170 or 180 human trafficking tips for the state of Iowa. Law enforcement, again, the percentage gets pretty low for a lot of reasons as to what we see and what actually comes into contact with law enforcement. Things to look for, though, what we've been finding as these Polaris tips come in, and we are getting them more and more often. And what we're seeing is where local business owners are starting to pay attention to, say, a nail salon. And I don't want to, by any means, we don't want to categorize every nail salon or every massage salon, as human trafficking, because it absolutely is not. But there are certain ones that law enforcement is becoming aware of, and a lot of that information comes from community members, local business leaders. There's a couple different cities within Iowa that have changed local ordinances. Yeah. Johnston, and I believe Newton or Nevada is also one of them that has changed their local ordinances with a lot more stringent expectations and requirements of certain types of businesses that come into their communities. And so, but you can also, we've received tips from individuals in the mall, that may see a younger girl, not always a girl, but a younger child, maybe 12 to 15, 16 years old, with somebody kind of out of character. And if you pay attention, you can see that maybe they are being a little controlled or coerced or forced into certain behaviors, Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we get that information.
You mentioned paying attention, and Teresa, you reacted when I said I probably just am not paying attention. Where should we be paying attention? You mentioned shopping centers.
Everywhere. So the formula for this is that traffickers take a vulnerability, which we all have, but think of the vulnerabilities that, children may have, especially those who have been physically or sexually abused. There's a lot of different vulnerabilities. Then the human traffickers take a method of manipulation, which can be the force, fraud, or coercion. They threaten the family member, they threaten the girl or the boy. They bribe them, they blackmail them, they do all sorts of grooming techniques with them, and then they exploit them. And so that can occur anywhere. We see this occurring in schools. We see this occurring in malls, at ball games, at parties, at certain massage parlors, at certain nail salons, just about anywhere. In fact, Breaking Traffic out of the Quad Cities is another wonderful anti-human trafficking organization, and they did a documentary called Any Kid Anywhere, because it's literally anybody anywhere can be victimized by this.
Wow. Scary.
It is. And a lot of the victims of human trafficking look like people you see every day. So you just have to look a little harder.
So it isn't necessarily someone that we would think of as coming from a different country, or...
It certainly can be, but not necessarily. And what we have found on the law enforcement side, and Teresa mentioned, they may be victims of sex abuse or physical abuse of some other nature. And a lot of the same characteristics of those vulnerable children or young adults are also the characteristics that we're seeing within the human trafficking. Maybe it's, two parents that both work outside the home long hours, and there's not a lot of adult supervision. It could be a foster situation. It could be children coming from from a home with only one parent present. they cater and they groom to the audience or to what they see as potential victims. A lot of it is online solicitation. And whether some of these handlers come in or go online as maybe a 14-year-old boy and they're trying to find a 13 or 14-year-old girl, they agree to meet and come to find out it's an adult male or a couple of adult males or a male and a female, but then they have coercion over them. They may force them into some type of act. There's a lot of blackmailing that goes on, that if maybe there was an exchange of nude pictures, well, then the threat will be there that we'll expose this to everybody in your school or to your parents or what have you, unless you do this.
Wow. So we all know the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of medicine or whatever it is. Is that the best way to combat this?
Especially in this, because we are finding that we're only able to rescue or get people out of this 1% to 2%.
Wow.
So 98 to 99% of the people remain in human trafficking until their death. And also, we're finding that the average life expectancy once trafficked is only 7 years, because their life is so horrible. And the number one reason that they die is outright homicide, and the number two reason is suicide, because their life is so horrible and they see just no hope. And so we're not getting them out. They're dying in this, and so prevention is absolutely essential. And he had mentioned the online solicitation, and I'm so glad you did, because that is by far the biggest problem that we have today with human trafficking. The online solicitation is just becoming more and more rampant. And I read a statistic that the FBI estimates that there are 50,000 child predators online every single second. Just trolling, just looking for those vulnerabilities that we've both mentioned. And that all the children have them, and they're posting too much information online. They're posting too much information about where they live, their parents' names, how they feel about their parents. So we know of a girl who posted online, "I hate my mom," and within 45 minutes, she was trafficked by a woman who had befriended her in the past, and like he had mentioned, pretended to be a different type of person. She had pretended to be a younger person that was interested in the same things this girl was interested in. It turned out to be a 45-year-old woman who was a trafficker, and she abducted her.
Wow. And that was here in Iowa? Mm-hmm. Wow. I keep saying, wow, I really had no idea it was this big of an issue. Teresa, I want to come back to you. I know you do work in Guatemala with trafficking as well. What got you started with this?
That's a really good question, because I'm a nurse practitioner in the neonatal ICU. So what is the nurse practitioner doing? But I'm also a pastor and missionary, and I've been doing international healthcare for years, and we would go over there and set up a free medical clinic. And as the people came in for the free medical clinic, I was noticing these other things, and it turned out to be human trafficking. And so I was just outraged that no one was doing anything about it, it seemed, right? So I came back to the United States to formulate teams and do research to go back over there and take care of it. And what I discovered in the meantime was that it was happening right here in the United States, right here in Iowa, and oh my goodness, right here in my hometown. I couldn't hardly believe it, like you. I had all these oh wow moments, and I couldn't believe it. And so I had to do something.
And why Guatemala? What? Just because that's where you had been going?
Pretty much, yeah. We have contacts in Guatemala and an organization that's willing to partner with us and work together. So we'll start there.
Okay, sure. Mitch, I wanted to pretty much change subjects completely at this point. My understanding of the way many people who trade in sex, especially females, are often treated by law enforcement very poorly. That they are viewed as the criminal as opposed to the victim. You've also alluded to the fact that being in law enforcement makes it difficult for you to deal with people who have been trafficked. How do you go about dealing with people that I would call victims of being trafficked?
You know, and a lot of it is, and I wouldn't say that law enforcement has a tough time and that we look as the victims as kind of the perpetrators. The old school feeling maybe is that it was just prostitution.
Right.
And therefore, the prostitute is a suspect, not the victim. It hasn't been until recently until our society has started to understand the problem of human trafficking that we realize they are not a suspect, they are a victim. Now, is that to say that there aren't prostitutes still that are willingly there?
Sure.
You know, there probably is. However, law enforcement, I feel, and especially with the DCI, and I would say especially in Iowa with law enforcement, has always taken sexual abuse and sexual assault victims very seriously. And we go through a lot of training on how to work with, in conjunction with sex abuse victims, sexual assault victims, and not only in law enforcement or the actual officers, but the prosecution. For certainly the Iowa Attorney General's office and a lot of the county attorney's offices have victim witness coordinators that have a almost daily or weekly contact with these victims. A lot of them, as I mentioned earlier, are sometimes reluctant, and especially in the beginning, and especially not only just sex abuse victims, but human trafficking victims, because they have been forced, they have been coerced, they have been blackmailed, and most importantly, they've been threatened. And so it takes a lot of work from law enforcement's perspective, because we're there, just like everybody else involved with this, to try to save them, number one, and get them out of that lifestyle, but to also, as importantly, hold the traffickers responsible.
Sure.
You know, it seems like state law in Iowa and federal law is not constantly changing, but changing quite often in the last few years, and everything's getting ramped up, and gone from the old prostitution charges to now where it's human trafficking, and it ranges from B and C felonies. You know, so there's some, and that's just on the state side. If you get into the federal side and you have the online enticement and you have the production of pornography and so many other contributing factors, the sentences are just phenomenal, honestly, as to holding these traffickers accountable. It is a tough problem, and no one wants to see, especially a child, become victim of anything. And so law enforcement takes that very, very serious. It's, again, we don't always have the cooperation from the victims. We certainly try. One of the things that we do immediately is try to get them with a sex abuse advocate or sexual assault advocate. And a lot of times, most times I would guess, probably 99% of the time, it's a woman, if not 100% of the time. But, to try to have that relationship and build that bond with the victims.
Sure. When I teach my ethics classes at UNI, we talk about the distinction between an ethical dilemma, which is something where both sides are right or both sides are wrong and you have to make a choice. And the other idea is a moral temptation, where there's a right versus a wrong. I mean, pretty clearly, this is wrong. Is the primary motive for the traffickers money? How much money do they make at this?
I hate to tell the general public how much money that they make at this, because I don't want anybody to think, oh, I should do that.
Right.
Right. Hopefully our viewers won't need that.
But I think you could make a similar comparison to drug traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's a tax-free because it's illegal, so they're obviously not paying taxes. And unfortunately, in our society, there's a market out there.
Right.
just like there is
Right.
for illegal drugs or legal drug or prescription drugs. Sex trade and prostitution is one of the oldest,
The oldest profession.
professions
Yes.
on the books. Exactly. And so unfortunately there is a market. You talk to some of my predecessors before the internet that was in law enforcement, and it maybe wasn't as prevalent because it wasn't as easy for them. Now with the internet, everybody's anonymous if you want to be, and the entire world is literally at your fingertips. And some of the cases that our Internet Crimes Against Children unit has worked have been on tips from overseas, from Guatemala, from China, from Japan, from Russia, and it may have some type of nexus back here in the little state of Iowa. And so it is literally worldwide, and it is at your fingertips. Your child, a 12 or 13-year-old girl, could be thinking that they're talking to somebody across town, and they're talking to a trafficker, across the country or across the world.
Sure. Well,
And
unfortunately,
also-
we are close to running out of time. I'd like to ask each of you to provide an idea of something we can do or something we haven't covered yet. What should we leave our viewers with? Teresa?
I think to leave your viewers with some action steps. And the first thing I would say to do is educate yourself. Educate yourself on the prevalence and what it is, what it looks like, signs and symptoms, so that if you are driving down the interstate and you stop at a truck stop and you see something suspicious, you know what you're looking for, you know the number to call, with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, you know what to look for in your community. If you're in a church youth group or schools, your children's friends, educate the youth, educate everyone in your family, your nephews, your nieces, your grandchildren, your children, your youth group, your community, your neighbors, your friends, all of them, and just be educated and then look out for each other, because there's not enough law enforcement, there's not enough advocates, there's not enough of us to go around, so we need the community.
Okay. Quickly, Mitch.
Yes, law enforcement is taking a very aggressive approach to this and training our uniformed officers on all levels, state, city, county, during traffic stops. She mentioned truck stops. The Department of Transportation and the Iowa State Patrol does a lot more patrolling within the larger truck stops because a lot of reports come from them, from truck stop areas. And it's one of those see something, say something. Everybody in society today is so afraid to pick up the phone and be the one to make that call. We would rather have it come into law enforcement and it be nothing and check out versus an actual victim.
Thank you. Fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time. On behalf of the Interreligious Council of Linn County, I'd like to thank both of you very much for being with us, and I'd like to thank the viewers for watching us. Have a great week.